Working on an oil rig is no easy job, but I never expected the horror that would come with it. It's a place in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by the deep, dark sea. The isolation can play tricks on your mind, but it's not just the loneliness that gets to you. The rig has rules, strange, unsettling rules. And when I first started, I thought they were just to keep us safe. I quickly learned they were to keep something else at bay. I can't explain everything, but the rules were the only thing standing between us and something far more terrifying than the dangers of the sea. It all started when I got a call from a company I had never heard of. They were offering a job on an oil rig way out in the ocean. The money was good, too good to turn down, and I was desperate. The man on the phone, Mr. Thompson, seemed eager to get me on board. He kept talking about how they needed someone fast, someone tough, and that I fit the bill. I didn't ask too many questions. I was just happy to have a job. The first thing that hit me when I arrived at the rig was the smell. Salty, metallic, and something else I couldn't place. The rig was massive, towering above the ocean like a metal fortress. The crew was small, about 15 guys, all of them looking like they'd been there too long. I shook hands with the foreman, Greg. He didn't smile, didn't say much, just gave me a hard stare and a simple, "Follow the rules." On my first day, they handed me a rule book. It wasn't thick, but the rules were strange. The first few seemed normal, stuff about safety, keeping your gear clean, never smoking near the tanks. But then there were rules that didn't make sense. Rule 10, don't leave your cabin after midnight. Rule 12, if you hear knocking on the walls, do not respond. Rule 15, never look into the water after sunset. The first night I stayed in my cabin, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing sounds, metal clanking, the wind howling through the rig's steel beams. And then, right around midnight, I heard it, knocking. Soft at first, like someone tapping on the walls outside my room. I remembered the rule and stayed still, heart pounding in my chest. The knocking grew louder, more urgent. I wanted to check, but something told me not to. I lay there in the dark, frozen, until the sound stopped. The next day, I met more of the crew. There was Mike, the quiet guy who worked maintenance, and Jason, a loudmouth who couldn't stop talking about how long he'd been there. They all seemed on edge, like something was always bothering them. When I asked about the knocking, Mike just shook his head. "You heard it, didn't you?" he said. "Don't ever answer it. It's not what you think." A few days later, I broke Rule 15 without meaning to. I was outside finishing up some work and I lost track of time. The sun was setting, casting a fiery glow over the ocean. It was beautiful, but then something caught my eye. Movement in the water. It looked like a shadow, something big circling the rig. My heart raced as I remembered the rule. I turned away, quickly heading back inside, my hands trembling. I didn't sleep well that night. I got put on the night shift soon after. Greg handed me a flashlight and told me to do rounds, checking the equipment and making sure everything was running smoothly. I hated it. The rig at night was a different place, cold, quiet, and eerie. The wind sounded like whispers, and the shadows seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I kept to myself, sticking close to the lights, never letting my flashlight flicker. During a break, Jason told me a story. "You know, a guy went missing here a few years back," he said, his voice low. "He broke one of the rules, left his cabin after midnight to go check on something. They found his boot floating in the water the next day. That's all, just the boot." He laughed, but it wasn't funny. No one's ever seen him since. One night, while I was on rounds, my flashlight died. I was in one of the far corners of the rig where the lights didn't reach, and suddenly I was plunged into darkness. My heart skipped a beat and I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work. As I did, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I spun around, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped and the air grew colder. I didn't stay to find out what it was. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The knocking came back almost every night now, always just after midnight. I told Greg about it, and he gave me the same look he always did. "Just follow the rules, kid. That's all you need to do." But it was easier said than done. The knocks were getting louder, harder to ignore, and I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if I opened the door. Greg pulled me aside one morning, his face grim. "I know this place gets to you. It gets to everyone. But listen to me, you don't break the rules. Not ever. It's not worth it." I nodded, but I could see the fear in his eyes. It wasn't just for me, it was for himself too. Whatever was out there, it had everyone on edge. One evening while I was on the platform, I saw something or someone standing near the edge of the rig, staring out at the sea. It was too far away to make out any details, but it wasn't one of the crew. They were all accounted for. I blinked and the figure was gone. When I asked Greg about it, he just muttered under his breath and walked away. A few weeks later, Mike left the rig. No one said why, but I had a feeling he couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the rules, the strange things we weren't allowed to talk about, it was too much. I overheard Jason say that Mike had broken Rule 10 and that he'd seen something no one should ever see. I wondered what he meant by that. The sounds on the rig were getting worse. It wasn't just the knocking anymore. I heard whispers were voices in the wind, calling my name. I thought I was losing it, but when I brought it up with the other guys, they just nodded. They'd heard them too. One night, Greg finally opened up to me. "There's something out there," he said, his voice shaking. "Something old, something dangerous. It's been here long before the rig. The rules are the only thing keeping us safe." He wouldn't say more, but that was enough for me. One night, a thick fog rolled in from the sea, wrapping around the rig like a cold, damp blanket. It was strange. This far out, we rarely got fog, especially not one this dense. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. The other guys were quiet, unusually so. I asked Jason if this was normal, and he just shook his head. "When the fog comes, you stay inside. It's in the rules, remember?" I did remember, but I didn't understand why. It was just fog, right? Nothing dangerous about that. Still, the way everyone was acting, it was clear this fog wasn't ordinary. I stayed in my cabin that night listening to the sounds of the rig creaking and the foghorn blaring every few minutes. I could have sworn I heard voices in the mist, but I convinced myself it was just the wind. The fog didn't lift the next day. It hung around, thicker than ever, making it impossible to work outside. We all stayed indoors, waiting for it to clear. That night, the knocking started again, louder than before. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, stepping into the mist. I could barely see a few steps ahead, but I felt like something was out there with me. I walked toward the edge of the rig, heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the very edge, looking down into the water. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. I called out, thinking it might be one of the crew, but it didn't respond. Just as I was about to approach it, I heard a voice behind me, Greg's voice, sharp and urgent. "Get back inside, now!" I didn't argue. I ran back to my cabin, locking the door behind me, the image of the figure still burned in my mind. The next day, the fog finally cleared, but I couldn't shake the feeling of what I had seen. I asked Greg about it, but he didn't want to talk. Jason, on the other hand, was more than willing to share. "There was a guy here a long time ago," he said, lowering his voice. "Broke Rule 12, the one about not answering the knocks. He disappeared that night. Some say he's still out there wandering the rig. Maybe that's who you saw." It sounded ridiculous, but I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine. I had seen something out there, and I didn't want to find out what it was. We were in the middle of a routine maintenance check when I noticed something strange about the water below the rig. It looked different, darker, almost black, and it seemed to be moving in ways that didn't match the currents. I called Greg over, and he took one look before pulling me away. "We don't talk about the water," he said, his voice cold. "Just stay away from it." I didn't understand why, but I knew better than to question him. The rig had too many secrets, and the water was clearly one of them. One night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the rules, about how strange they were and what they were really protecting us from. I decided to break Rule 15. I waited until the sun had set, then grabbed my flashlight and went out to the edge of the rig. The water below was calm, almost unnaturally so. I shone my light over the surface, half expecting to see something rise up from the depths. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, slowly, The water started to ripple. Something was down there, moving, coming closer to the surface. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I took a step back. Just as I was about to turn and run, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly, and saw Greg standing behind me, his face pale and angry. "You don't ever break that rule," he hissed. "If you see what's in that water, it'll never let you go." A few days later, one of the newer guys on the rig, Tom, went missing. He hadn't been there long, but he was a good worker. One night, he didn't show up for his shift. We searched the rig, called out for him, but there was no trace of him anywhere. His cabin was empty, his tools untouched. The only thing we found was his hard hat, floating in the water near the edge of the platform. Greg didn't say much, just that Tom had probably fallen into the water. But I knew better. I had seen what was down there, and I knew it had taken him. After Tom's disappearance, the mood on the rig grew even darker. Everyone was on edge, but Jason, as always, tried to lighten the mood with his jokes. One night, while we were all sitting in the mess hall, he started making fun of the rules. "What's next?" he laughed. "Don't sneeze more than twice in a row or the rig ghosts will get you." No one else laughed. Greg shot him a warning look, but Jason just kept going. "Come on, you guys don't really believe all this crap, do you? It's just a bunch of superstitions." But deep down, I think we all knew there was more to the rules than just superstition. That night, Jason broke Rule 10. He left his cabin after midnight, said he needed to grab something from the deck. We heard him leave, heard his footsteps echoing through the rig. And then, just after he left, the knocking started again. This time it wasn't on my cabin door, it was on Jason's. We all heard it, loud and insistent. Jason didn't come back. The next morning we searched for Jason. Just like with Tom, there was no sign of him. His cabin door was open, his bed untouched. Greg didn't even try to explain this one. He just gathered us all in the mess hall and reminded us of the rules. "They're there for a reason," he said, his voice low. "If you break them, you disappear." No one questioned him after that. One evening during a routine check, I noticed something strange. The water level around the rig seemed to be rising, slowly but steadily. It wasn't a storm or a tide, it was something else. The black water was creeping closer, lapping at the metal supports like it was hungry. I told Greg about it, but he just nodded grimly. "It's time," he said, and that was all. Greg called a meeting in the mess hall that night. He told us we needed to be extra careful now. The rig was in danger, not just from the water, but from something else, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for a long time. "We have to stick to the rules," he said, "or we're all done for." That night, the power went out. The entire rig was plunged into darkness. The only sound, the wind howling through the metal beams and the distant crash of the waves. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the control room, but when I got there, Greg was already inside, fiddling with the controls. "It's not the storm," he muttered, his voice tight. "It's them." With the power out, the rig was even more terrifying. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and every creak and groan of the metal felt like a threat. I tried to stay calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, moving in the dark, waiting for us to slip up. That night, the knocking came again, louder and more insistent than ever before. This time I felt an overwhelming urge to open the door, to see who or what was knocking. My hand hovered over the handle, trembling. Then I remembered Greg's words. "If you answer it, you disappear." I stepped away from the door, heart racing, and listened as the knocks grew quieter, then stopped. The next day, Greg was gone. His cabin was empty, his radio silent. No one had heard anything during the night, but I knew what had happened. He had broken the rules, just like Jason, just like Tom. And now he was gone, taken by whatever was out there. With Greg gone, the rest of the crew looked to me for answers, but I didn't have any. We were all on edge, watching every shadow, listening to every sound. The rules were the only thing keeping us from panicking completely. But without Greg, we didn't know what to do next. Jason, Tom, and now Greg were gone. Whatever had taken them was getting closer. I gathered the crew in the mess hall and told them the truth. We need to stick to the rules more than ever. It's the only way we'll survive." But deep down, I wasn't sure we could. That night, the storm hit again. It wasn't just wind and rain this time. It felt like the whole ocean was angry. Waves crashed against the rig with a force that shook the metal beneath our feet. The black water surged up the sides of the platform, higher than I'd ever seen before. We huddled inside, listening to the roar of the storm outside, praying the rig would hold. But something was different this time. There was something in the storm, something that wanted us gone. As the storm raged, I heard a voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from any of the radios or from one of the crew members. It was coming from outside. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make out what it was saying. It sounded like a warning, but I couldn't understand the words. The voice was calling to me, telling me to leave the rig, to escape before it was too late. I wanted to ignore it, but something about the voice felt familiar, almost like Greg's. The next day, we discovered the rig's lower levels were flooding. Water was seeping in from beneath, pooling in the corridors. It wasn't just rainwater. This was the dark, oily water from the ocean, the kind that moved unnaturally. We had to shut off the lower levels, abandoning parts of the rig we'd used for years. It felt like the rig itself was slowly being swallowed, bit by bit. As I was cleaning out Greg's cabin, I found something I hadn't expected: a journal. It was hidden under his mattress, worn and filled with scrawled notes in his rough handwriting. As I flipped through the pages, I realized Greg had known more about the rig's secrets than he'd ever let on. The journal talked about the rules, but it also mentioned something else, something deep beneath the rig, a presence. He called it the sleeper. According to Greg, it had been trapped down there for centuries, and the rig had been built to keep it contained. But now, the sleeper was waking up. I shared the journal with the remaining crew, but they didn't want to believe it. Jason's jokes had stopped, and now everyone was too scared to even talk about what was happening. But I knew Greg's words were true. I had felt it myself. The presence in the water, the strange movements, the shadows in the fog. The sleeper was real, and it was coming for us. The water was everywhere now, rising faster than we could keep up with. Every hour we found another part of the rig flooded, another passageway cut off. It was like the rig itself was sinking into the black abyss. I couldn't shake the feeling that the water wasn't just rising, it was alive. I had seen it moving, seen it reaching out like tendrils, pulling things under. The sleeper was using the water to claim the rig, and it was only a matter of time before it took us too. By now, there were only a few of us left. The others had either disappeared or left the rig in a panic despite the rules. The remaining crew were on edge, barely holding it together. I could see the fear in their eyes, the desperation. We were running out of time. Some of them wanted to abandon the rig, take one of the lifeboats and sail for shore. But I knew better. Greg's journal had warned about what happened to those who left the rig before the sleeper was contained. They didn't make it far. I kept going back to Greg's journal, hoping to find something, anything that could help us. Toward the end of the journal, I found a page that chilled me to my core. There was one final rule, one that Greg had never told us about. Rule 21, when the sleeper wakes, there is no escape. I felt my heart sink. We were trapped. The rules hadn't been there to protect us. They were there to keep us in place, to prevent the sleeper from spreading. If we left, it would follow us. That night, the rig trembled like never before. I could feel it deep in the core of the platform, a rumbling that shook the walls and floors. The others felt it too. This wasn't just a storm. This was the sleeper, waking from its long slumber. The lights flickered, and we all huddled together in the control room. I could hear the knocking again, but this time it was everywhere, on the walls, the doors, the floors. It was surrounding us, closing in. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just coming from outside the cabins anymore. It was inside, echoing through the very walls of the rig. We had nowhere left to run. The water had flooded most of the lower levels, and the upper decks were shaking with every passing minute. I felt a sense of dread settle over me as I realized there was nothing we could do. The sleeper was awake and it wanted us gone. In our last meeting, we faced a grim choice. Some of the crew wanted to try the lifeboats despite what the journal said. They figured it was better to take their chances in the open ocean than to stay on the rig with the sleeper. Others wanted to stay, to try and fight it off somehow. But deep down, we all knew the truth. There was no fighting the sleeper. It was too powerful, too ancient. A few of the crew took the lifeboat despite my warnings. I watched them lower it into the dark water, their faces pale with fear. As they rowed away, the fog began to roll in again, thicker than ever. Within minutes, the lifeboat vanished into the mist. I waited, listening, hoping they would make it. But all I heard was a single distant splash, followed by silence. The fog was back, creeping over the rig like a shroud. This time, it didn't feel like a natural occurrence. It felt like the sleeper was using it, hiding within it. The remaining crew stayed inside, too terrified to step outside. But I knew we couldn't hide forever. The sleeper was coming for us, and it wouldn't stop until it had claimed the rig completely. I could feel it now, a presence in the water beneath the rig. The black water churned and bubbled, as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. The sleeper was rising, coming closer with each passing moment. I tried to keep the crew calm, but it was no use. We were all beyond saving now. The sleeper had us in its grasp, and there was no escaping its reach. In the middle of the night, I heard it again, the voice. This time it was louder, clearer. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a booming, guttural sound that echoed through the rig. The sleeper was speaking to us, calling us to the water. I could feel its pull, the irresistible urge to step outside, to go to the edge of the platform and let the water take me. But I fought it, knowing that once I stepped into the water, I would never return. We were down to our final hours. The water had risen to the upper levels, and the rig was barely holding together. The remaining crew had locked themselves in their cabins, hoping to wait it out. But I knew it was hopeless. The sleeper was awake, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. With no other options left, I made my way to the control room. The rig was falling apart around me, the metal groaning and creaking as the water continued to rise. I could hear the knocking again, louder than ever, as if the sleeper itself was trying to break through the walls. I didn't know what I was hoping to find in the control room, but I had to try something, anything, to stop it. As I stood in the control room, I realized there was only one way to stop the sleeper. Greg's journal had mentioned a fail-safe, a way to sink the rig completely, to send it back down into the abyss where the sleeper belonged. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only way. If the sleeper escaped the rig, it would spread, and there would be no stopping it. I activated the fail-safe, setting off a series of explosions deep within the rig. The platform shook violently as the charges went off, one after the other. I could feel the rig sinking, slowly being pulled down into the depths of the ocean. As the water closed in around me, I knew I had done the right thing. The sleeper would be trapped again, at least for a little while. But as the darkness swallowed me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it would wake again someday.